Can you believe that it's been 5 years since the launch of Final Fantasy XV? The road trip of 4 best friends and their journey to restore light to a darkened world. The initial ambition for this project was to enable multiplayer options for the main cast, previously only available in Final Fantasies V, VI, and IX, not counting the MMORPGs. As the development team noticed this would make the game endless, it was later decided to instead include a DLC expansion pack covering the World of Ruin section of the narrative. Instead of the 4 bros, the players would control the Kingsglaive, magical knights of the city Insomnia. This may seem like a throwaway experience for many, and whether you loved or hated Final Fantasy XV, Comrades is surprisingly extraordinary. Extraordinary enough that the DLC expansion was later repackaged as a standalone experience and has a cult following still playing actively to this day. Not only do I believe there is enough interesting material to reflect on in this game, there is plenty of fascinating behind-the-scenes information regarding the game's development for new fans and longtime adorers of the series alike. Being already eminently themed around friendship and camaraderie, perhaps this multiplayer venture, Comrades, is the closest to fulfilling the project vision of a fantasy based on reality. Insomnia, the city that never sleeps, protected by the magic of the sacred crystal. The death of King Regis ushered in the absence of the said crystal and the enchanting protection contained within. The loyal knights of the king, the Kingsglaive, scattered into hiding without the authority of their ancient powers, for the crystal now belonged to Niflheim, the tyrannical empire. In perception of the once lively Insomnia, the world is shrouded in darkness. Comrades stars the before-mentioned Kingsglaive, in which the players are able to create from scratch. The game takes place during the 10-year slumber of Noctis while he's in the crystal, also known as the World of Ruin. It's not necessary for the story of Final Fantasy XV, but there are neat moments nonetheless. The narrative is more integrated into the gameplay, which is one of the shining lights of Comrades. The battle system is much like the base game of 15, but with many more customizable options. The game is laid out in a questing format that I've heard is similar to the Monster Hunter series, one that I have not yet tried. Completing these quests rewards you with experience that you can cash in on a map to unlock additional missions. As the glaives fight to replenish light to the cities and outposts of the land, They're able to restore their magical powers as they find the tombs of the ancient kings. This is already one element that is improved over the base game. Each of these royal sigils grants enhanced abilities and stats to different playstyles. If you want to be a powerhouse, you'll choose the Tall's sigil. If you're a healer, you'll probably equip the Oracle sigil. My personal favorite is the Rogue's sigil, one that enhances aerial combat. One of the fatal flaws of FF15's battle system comes from the ability to use items at any time. If you have several Phoenix Downs or elixirs, you absolutely cannot lose. Comrades restricts healing to mages and resurrection to individual pieces of food found on the map, in which the player can only hold one at a time. These aspects, along with the weapon crafting system, have offered a much more strategic element than found in Final Fantasy XV. Now, the weapon crafting is the pinnacle gameplay indulgence of Comrades. Imagine the experience-based element from Final Fantasy XIII's mixed with the custom abilities element from Final Fantasy X. All of that mixed in a blender with truly addicting rare loot farming, and you've got the best weapon crafting system in the entire Final Fantasy series. I really mean that. Whenever you go on certain missions, each enemy will drop loot that can then be used to improve specific stats on each weapon. The weapon choices are also much more diverse than FF15, such as the ability to wield an axe, katana, crossbow, or even a shuriken, without it being exclusive to a royal weapon. There are a few different factors to keep track of. Look for the clear lines underneath each stat. This means that this threshold must be satisfied in order for the weapon to be able to progress past its current level cap. Each type of loot will raise certain stats. Some can be tempting when you see high stat boosts, but also may spend more experience points in the process, thus not being the best idea in the long run. Some items will contain a passive or active ability which can then be used to add or replace the abilities of the weapon being customized. Proper attention to this can make or break some of the game's ultimate super bosses, who I believe to be some of the toughest the series has to offer. Mastering this crafting system is vital to your enjoyment of Comrade. Whether it be farming the necessary materials or finally getting that rare weapon to drop, it's a genuine wonder of an experience. If you combine the heart and openness of Final Fantasy XV with the gameplay and difficulty balance of Comrades, you'd have an almost perfect game. The soundtrack of Comrades is small in size, but the story behind it is possibly the most interesting element of the game's development. Nobuo Uematsu, the longtime composer for the series, did not compose anything for the base game of Final Fantasy XV, but did compose the main theme of Comrades, Choosing Hope, as well as a couple other tracks, including the final boss theme. What's amazed me about Uematsu's work over the years isn't just his incredibly catchy melodies, but also his dabbling in various genres of music. I think all of the Final Fantasy songs I've written thus far have followed the same format, a standard piano ballad in 4/4 time. Of course, I was playing to my strengths when I decided on that composition style, but I thought it might be nice to break away from the formula for a change. Part of the reason was because I didn't think it would fit the world of Comrades. As I read through the reference materials I received from the team, I realized pretty sounding music wouldn't be enough this time. The game focuses on the sorrow of the human condition and the strengths of defying a higher power, so I decided to try my hand at something new: gospel music. Granted, I'm not sure whether one can really call Choosing Hope a gospel piece, but I think the music does an excellent job of conveying the before-mentioned idea of sorrow and strength, and I'm extremely happy with the way it turned out. Uematsu has also gone on record claiming that recording Choosing Hope was the only time he has cried in studio while creating music. I can probably speak for many when I say this, but I believe what I love most about Uematsu's work is that I almost always know when it is his track versus another composer, as if he doesn't follow any rules or trends. I've spent a lot of time researching development philosophies behind the creators in the series, primarily Hironobu Sakaguchi and Nobuo Uematsu. One of the most fascinating tidbits I've found about Uematsu is located within the Final Fantasy XV official works book. Back when I was working with Sakaguchi-san, we were really a bunch of amateurs. We had no idea what we were doing, and we just charged ahead with no fear. A lot of times I'll say, the difference between someone who went to music school and me, somebody who never learned from a book, is that the people who learn the right way know all kinds of things, including what not to do. So they can easily come up with things everyone thinks are beautiful, but it's tougher for them to do something unique. People like me who haven't been to school aren't afraid of anything. We do anything we want, however we feel like doing it. It can come out boring and dull, but sometimes there's a chemical reaction and things explode. So with the early Final Fantasy titles, we were a bunch of total amateurs, doing whatever we wanted, and amazingly, people liked it. Although recently, we've been bringing lots of pros on board, so things are different these days. This is a bit off topic, but in this same interview, completely unrelated to Final Fantasy XV, Uematsu claims that the track he listens to constantly is interestingly Distant Worlds from Final Fantasy XI, another one of my personal favorites as well. Yoko Shimomura, who composed the base game of 15, claims the battle theme from Final Fantasy II to be her favorite track in the entire series. Even though Choosing Hope's gospel-inspired sound isn't common for the series, it does still have that classic Uematsu charm, full of heart and focus. Kazuya Takahashi, after landing the role as director of Comrades, instantly knew he must bring Uematsu on board for the project. After hearing Choosing Hope, he claimed, "We listened to it and realized it really was incredibly good. Now the development team was under pressure, thinking we've got such a great theme song on our hands. Now we have to come up with a middle and ending that's just as great." At the end stages of development, when times were tough, we all drew energy from listening to that song. Ironic that in the toughest times of development, Choosing Hope was the source of motivation. I actually liken this story to Hajime Tabata's consultation with Hironobu Sakaguchi on the main game of Final Fantasy XV. It's not news to anyone that Square's reputation prior had gone through its rough patches. Tabata wanted to return Final Fantasy to its once immaculate reputation, starting at the source. Sakaguchi instilled in Tabata the importance of the challenger mindset, that being seeking new challenges when developing a Final Fantasy game, one in which Sakaguchi has claimed 15's Tabata and 14's Yoshida to both possess. Speaking of Tabata, this is the brilliant story of how Comrades came to be, from the words of Kazuya Takahashi, director of Comrades. I remember writing the proposal for Comrades during the final week when we were mastering up the main game, putting the finishing touches on software and update data. Tabata was traveling around the world on business at the time, so I emailed it to him and asked, "What do you think?" His response was, "Cool." I mentioned before that Comrades takes place during the World of Ruin section of Final Fantasy XV. Players familiar with the series know that term, World of Ruin, is mostly recognized in Final Fantasy VI, Hajime Tabata's favorite game in the series. I thought it was a nice nod to see the color palette for the world to be similar to that section of FF6. There is even a unique fight in Comrades directly referencing the iconic creature Deathgaze from Final Fantasy VI. It is even accompanied by a remix of the decisive battle. There are plenty of homages to the early Final Fantasy games, such as Omega and Melusine from Final Fantasy V, but most of those already existed in Final Fantasy XV. Outside of the fights, there are tiny bits of throwback charm. If you're looking closely, whenever switching weapons to a katana, your character will do the iconic Furion pose from Final Fantasy II. If you don't really like playing multiplayer games, it is possible to play with AI members instead, and they suck. Almost all of them have names that harken back to the very classic FF characters, such as Luca from Final Fantasy IV, and even Gutsuko from Final Fantasy III. Even though the story of Comrades isn't thematically brilliant or anything like that, I still have a personal emotional connection to it. My oldest brother passed away not long before its release. It was an incredibly difficult time for us all. There's not a lot you can do in those moments, but take time to grieve and reflect. It's easy to get lost in the regrets and what-ifs. To my utmost surprise, Comrades is something that helped me get through it. The themes of brotherhood and choosing hope never felt more relevant. Earlier I mentioned that the initial vision was for Final Fantasy XV to feature multiplayer for the 4 main characters. This was scrapped. However, there is a special quest that can be played in Comrades. Remember in the main game, after 10 years has passed and the guys reunite to head to the final showdown in Insomnia? The journey to Insomnia can be played single-player or multiplayer as a quest in Comrades, as the 4 heroes. I felt this way then, and I feel it to this day. Final Fantasy XV still has the best party relationship in the series. It really does feel like you are journeying with a group of best friends, or brothers. If you've experienced everything else in the Final Fantasy XV universe, this is a perfect way to cap it off. It feels like a final goodbye to the friends you hold most dear. To me, that reminds me a lot of my brother. That quest feels like a final goodbye I was never able to personally give. I don't get to reflect on a wondrous final dungeon for this reflection, for there is not one. But Comrades offers something special in its final boss fight.
a scar down to the bone, falling, failing to believe, living in so much despair with no hope of relief.
After a long era of uncertainty within the Final Fantasy fanbase, I truly feel that the recent years have been the best Final Fantasy has been since the exit of Hironobu Sakaguchi. No matter how you personally feel about the Final Fantasy XV experience, or even just Comrades, it brought the series back into the light as a challenger in the industry. Along with Final Fantasy XIV that has released critically acclaimed expansions, the ongoing Final Fantasy VII Remake, and the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI, the series still has a bright future ahead. Even when it seems all has been lost, and in the midst of any rough patch, choose hope.